Money does not vanish loudly. It slips away the same way trust does, without raising its voice. I learned that in my 71st year, sitting at my kitchen table in Birmingham, Alabama, staring at numbers that no longer added up. My name is Laverne Thomas. I have lived in the same brick house for 43 years. I raised 2 children there. I buried a husband there. I believed what I kept in that house was safe, especially what I earned slowly, dollar by careful dollar. I have never been careless with money. I grew up watching my mother stretch $5 across a week without complaint. I learned early that security is not about abundance. It is about discipline, about preparing quietly for winters nobody else sees coming. After my husband passed, I tightened everything. I canceled what I did not need. I cooked at home. I fixed instead of replaced. I placed small amounts into savings each month, not for luxury, but for steadiness, for peace. That savings account became more than numbers. It was the proof that I could stand on my own legs, even after grief bent me. It was dignity stored in a bank ledger, patience translated into balance statements mailed in plain white envelopes. I never spoke much about it, not to friends, not even to my children. I believed some things grow better in silence. Money, like roots, does its best work underground. You do not dig it up just to prove it exists. My son Marcus lives across town. My daughter Elaine moved to Atlanta years ago. Marcus visits more often. He brings groceries sometimes, checks the smoke detectors, asks if the gutters need clearing. I appreciated that attention. I believed his presence meant protection. A son close by feels like insurance against the world's sharper edges. I didn't see him as a threat to anything I had built. That thought never crossed my mind. The first time I noticed something wrong, it was small, a withdrawal I did not remember making. I assumed I had forgotten. Age humbles you that way. You question yourself before you question anyone else. I pulled the statement closer, adjusted my glasses, traced the line with my finger. The amount was not large, but it was unfamiliar. I told myself I must have transferred it for something practical and simply failed to note it. I waited for the next month's statement before allowing concern to take shape. I have learned not to accuse without evidence, even in my own mind. Patience keeps foolishness from spreading. The second statement arrived on a Tuesday. I made tea before opening it, the way I always do. Routine steadies whatever might be hiding inside an envelope. The numbers did not steady me that day. Another withdrawal, larger this time. Still not catastrophic, but no longer dismissible. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. Not panic, not yet. Just awareness. Like noticing a door slightly ajar that you remember closing. I did not call the bank immediately. Instead, I sat at that table and looked around my kitchen. The same curtains, the same clock ticking above the stove. Nothing in the room had shifted, only the account. I told myself there must be an explanation. Systems make mistakes, banks misprint. I had trusted institutions before. I was not ready to believe the loss was personal. Not yet. I went to the bank that Thursday morning, dressed the way I always do when handling serious matters. Navy skirt, pressed blouse, sensible shoes. I have found that presentation invites respect, even when your voice remains soft. The young teller greeted me kindly. She called me ma'am and smiled with the brightness of someone who has not yet seen much hardship. I handed her the statement and asked her to help me understand the withdrawals. She typed for a long moment, eyes scanning her screen. Her expression shifted slightly, not alarmed, just careful. She explained that the transactions were authorized transfers made through online access. Online access. I felt the word settle slowly. I do not use online banking. I prefer paper statements, face-to-face conversations. I told her that. She nodded and called over a manager. The manager was older, composed, efficient. He asked if anyone else had access to my account. I hesitated. I had added Marcus years ago, after my husband passed, in case something happened to me. the time, it seemed responsible, a safeguard. If I fell ill or forgot a bill, my son could step in. That decision had felt wise. I said his name aloud in the manager's office, and it echoed differently than usual. The manager confirmed that the transfers were initiated through Marcus's login credentials. He said it without accusation, simply stating fact. I listened without interrupting, hands folded in my lap. There was no fraud alert, no hacking, just authorized movement of money from savings to another account. My account, his account. I thanked the manager for clarifying and asked for printed records. Walking back to my car, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. That surprised me. I had expected dizziness, maybe anger. Instead, I felt a slow unfolding, like a curtain being drawn back inch by inch. I sat in the driver's seat but did not start the engine. I read through the transaction list carefully. Dates lined up over the past 6 months. Not a single dramatic sweep, just consistent withdrawals. He had been careful, not greedy in appearance, amounts that might escape notice if someone did not look closely. I considered that detail longer than the dollar figures. I drove home through familiar streets. The trees were beginning to turn. Birmingham carries its seasons gently. I watched the leaves and thought about how change can happen quietly while you are looking elsewhere. At home, I placed the papers on the kitchen table and sat down. I did not cry. Tears are not my first language. I thought instead about conversations Marcus and I had shared recently. He had mentioned bills, tight months, unexpected repairs. He had never asked directly for help. I had offered small amounts occasionally, willingly. That is what mothers do. But this was different. This was decision without discussion, assistance without consent. I had not been invited into the problem. I had simply been made part of its solution.
I did not call Marcus that afternoon. I let the papers remain where I placed them, spread neatly across the table like quiet witnesses. I needed time to sit with what I knew before I allowed his voice to enter the room. I have always believed that first reactions can cloud lasting judgment. Anger feels powerful in the moment, but it rarely builds anything worth keeping. I did not want heat. I wanted clarity. I replayed the months in my mind. His visits had not changed dramatically. He still brought groceries sometimes, still asked if the lawn service was coming regularly, still kissed my cheek before leaving. There had been no obvious shift, no sharp tone, no withdrawal of affection. If anything, he had seemed attentive. That detail troubled me more than distance would have. I thought about the day I added his name to my account. We were sitting at this same table. I remember telling him it was just in case I needed help someday. He squeezed my hand and said he would always look out for me. I believed him, not because he promised, but because he was my son. I raised him to understand responsibility. I taught him that taking without asking leaves a stain, even when the need feels urgent. That afternoon, I brewed another pot of tea and watched the steam rise. I asked myself a simple question. Had I missed signs? Not of desperation, but of entitlement. There were moments, small and forgettable at the time, times when he assumed I would cover a dinner bill without discussion, times when he joked about inheriting the house one day. I had dismissed those comments as harmless. Children sometimes speak from comfort, not calculation. I never wanted to suspect my own child of measuring my worth in assets. Still, the pattern before me was deliberate. 6 months of quiet transfers. No conversation, no mention. That kind of consistency requires intention. By evening, I had decided to call him the next day. Not to accuse, not to threaten, just to listen. I wanted to hear how he would explain something I now understood clearly. Sleep did not come easily that night. Not because I was afraid of losing money. What unsettled me was the space between us that I had not noticed forming. A parent imagines a certain transparency with her child, even in adulthood. You believe that respect matures alongside age. You believe that if your child needs you, he will say so plainly. The next morning, I called Marcus after breakfast. My voice sounded steady to my own ears. I asked if he could come by that evening. I said I had some paperwork I needed help understanding. He agreed without hesitation. That, too, I noted. There was no pause, no guarded tone, just the same easy assurance he had always carried. When I hung up, I looked again at the bank statements. The numbers no longer confused me. They had already told their story. What remained uncertain was the story he would offer in return.
Marcus arrived just before sunset. He walked in with the same familiar stride, carrying a small bag of oranges he said were on sale. He kissed my cheek and asked how I was feeling. I told him I was well and motioned toward the kitchen table. The papers were stacked neatly in front of my chair. I did not hand them to him immediately. Instead, I poured us both a glass of water and sat down across from him, allowing the silence to settle first. I slid the statements toward him without commentary. He glanced down casually at first, then more carefully. I watched his eyes move across the lines. His shoulders tightened, almost imperceptibly. He cleared his throat and leaned back. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he explained that he had meant to talk to me about it. He said things had been tight. He said he assumed I would understand. Assumed. That word rested between us heavier than any accusation could. I asked him how long he had been transferring the money. He answered honestly, about 6 months. He spoke calmly, as if outlining a practical decision. He said he intended to replace it when things improved. He said it was temporary. He said he did not want to worry me. I listened without interruption. My hands remained folded on the table. I did not ask why he had not simply asked me. I already knew the answer would circle around convenience. He told me he had access, so he used it. That was the sentence that settled everything. Not the money, the logic. I asked him whether he believed the account belonged equally to both of us. He hesitated before saying he thought of it as family resources, something we all shared. I felt no surge of anger, just a quiet shift inside me. I told him the account was built from my years of work, my restraint, my sacrifice. It was not communal by default. He looked surprised at my tone, though I had not raised it. Perhaps he expected softness. Perhaps he expected me to absorb the explanation and move on. I asked him how he would feel if I entered his account without notice and decided what I needed from it. He smiled weakly and said it was different. I did not argue the difference. I simply asked him to explain it. He struggled. His words thinned out. That silence spoke more clearly than anything else he had said. I told him I was not concerned about helping him. I had always helped when asked. What troubled me was the absence of conversation. He nodded, but his eyes avoided mine. I realized then that he had not expected resistance. He had expected understanding without boundaries. When he left that evening, he promised to begin returning the money soon. I thanked him for coming by. After the door closed, the house felt altered in a way I could not yet name.
That night, I did not sit in the dark the way I sometimes do when something weighs on me. I turned on the kitchen light and wiped down counters that were already clean. Movement helps thoughts settle into order. Marcus's words replayed softly in my mind. Family resources, temporary. I did not question that he believed what he was saying. What unsettled me was how easily he believed it. I thought about the years after my husband died, the evenings I counted coins into envelopes marked utilities, groceries, insurance. No one shared those calculations with me. No one stood beside me at the table. I had never considered my savings a communal well. It was water I carried myself, bucket by bucket. The thought that someone felt entitled to dip in without asking altered something fundamental. The next morning, I called the bank again. I asked about removing online access and changing account permissions. The manager spoke patiently, guiding me through options. I chose to require dual authorization for any transfer. It was not a dramatic step. It did not close the account or remove Marcus's name entirely. It simply placed conversation where assumption had been. I did not inform him immediately. I wanted the change to exist without announcement, like a lock adjusted quietly after discovering a door left open. Over the following weeks, Marcus visited less frequently.
When he did come by, his manner was attentive but restrained. He mentioned beginning to repay small amounts, and true to his word, deposits appeared. I acknowledged them without praise. Repayment is not generosity. It is correction. I refused to treat it as a favor. Still, something else had shifted. He seemed to measure his words now, as if unsure of the boundaries. I realized that clarity can feel like distance to those who benefited from ambiguity. I examined my own heart carefully during that time. I did not want resentment to take root. Bitterness corrodes the vessel that carries it. I focused instead on understanding. I understood that Marcus likely did not wake one morning intending to betray me. He had likely justified each transfer as practical. Need has a way of bending morality when no one interrupts it. But I also understood that respect requires interruption. It requires the discipline to pause before taking what is not fully yours. One Sunday after church, a friend asked how I was managing these days. I told her I was learning new things about strength. She smiled, not pressing for detail. Strength at my age does not look like confrontation. It looks like recalibration. It looks like choosing where access ends and autonomy begins. In the quiet of my living room, I reviewed my budget again. The withdrawals had reduced my cushion more than I liked, but not beyond recovery. I made small adjustments. Fewer dinners out with friends. Delayed replacing the old washing machine. None of it catastrophic. Just careful. What I grieved most was not the balance. It was the innocence I had held about unquestioned trust. That loss felt larger than any sum printed on paper.
Time has a way of revealing what confrontation sometimes hides. In the weeks that followed, I watched Marcus more than I spoke. Observation can teach you the truth of a person's thinking without forcing them to declare it. He began calling before coming over. That had not always been his habit. I noticed the change and said nothing. Courtesy born from correction carries a different weight than courtesy born from habit. One evening, he mentioned a new expense at work, something about equipment he needed to purchase. He spoke carefully, glancing at me as if measuring my reaction. I listened, but I did not offer help. I have learned that silence can return responsibility to its rightful owner. If I rush to solve what another adult faces, I teach dependence, not partnership. He did not ask outright. That restraint told me something. Perhaps the new boundaries were being felt. Perhaps he was testing whether access had quietly reopened. The dual authorization at the bank worked as intended. One afternoon, I received a call confirming a requested transfer. I declined it calmly. Later that evening, Marcus called. He said he had forgotten about the new requirement. His tone held mild frustration, but not accusation. I reminded him gently that we agreed conversations should come first. There was a pause on the line. In that pause, I heard more than words could carry. I heard adjustment. I heard pride wrestling with necessity. He asked if we could talk in person. I agreed. When he arrived, he looked tired in a way I had not noticed before. Life had been pressing on him harder than he had admitted. We sat at the table again, papers absent this time. He spoke about debt, about pressure, about wanting to appear stable in front of his own family. I listened, truly listened. Need is real, struggle is real. I have known both, but so is the choice to honor the person who stands beside you. I told him I would help when asked, within reason. I would not be a hidden reservoir accessed in silence. He nodded slowly. For the first time, he looked directly at me and said he had convinced himself that I would not mind. That confession carried more weight than the transfers. It revealed the quiet reasoning he had relied upon. When he left that night, the house did not feel as altered as before. Something had been named, and naming can restore shape to what is blurred. Still, I understood that trust, once stretched, does not return to its original form. It reshapes itself, sometimes smaller, sometimes stronger, but never untouched. I began to think about the years when Marcus was young, when he would ask before taking the last biscuit from the plate. I taught him then that consideration builds character. Somewhere between childhood and manhood, that lesson had softened. It is easy to believe that adulthood automatically deepens respect. I have learned it does not. Respect must be practiced continually, especially within family, where familiarity can blur lines. Marcus started stopping by with envelopes in hand. Small repayments, steady and deliberate. He placed them on the table without ceremony. I accepted them without comment. I did not want repayment to become performance. What I sought was awareness, not apology rehearsed for comfort. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room, he glanced around and remarked that the house would need repairs soon. The roof, perhaps the plumbing. I heard concern in his voice, but I also heard calculation, future costs, future decisions, future inheritance, spoken gently under the surface. I asked him whether he worried about my comfort or about long-term property value. The question surprised him. He laughed lightly, but his eyes shifted. He said he only wanted to ensure I was secure. I believed part of that. Yet I also sensed that security meant different things to each of us. For him, security might include eventual ownership. For me, security meant autonomy while I was still breathing. That distinction settled inside me with quiet firmness. I began meeting with a financial advisor recommended by a church friend. I wanted my estate organized clearly. Not to punish, not to exclude, but to remove ambiguity. Ambiguity had already proven costly. The advisor listened carefully as I described my situation, without naming Marcus directly. He suggested a trust structure that would protect assets while I remained fully in control. I moved forward with the paperwork slowly, reading every page twice. I felt no rush, only steadiness. When I informed Marcus weeks later that I had reorganized my finances, I did so over dinner. I spoke plainly, without accusation. He looked startled at first, then quiet. I explained that clarity prevents confusion. I wanted everything transparent and formal. He asked whether I no longer trusted him. I told him trust and structure are not enemies. Structure protects trust from erosion. That evening ended without raised voices, but I sensed something shifting in him. Perhaps realization, perhaps disappointment. As I washed dishes afterward, I understood that boundaries sometimes feel like rejection to those who relied on open doors. Still, I chose the door with a lock.
The following weeks, Marcus slowed his visits further. Not absent, just more measured. I watched him arrive, pause at the door, then step inside with care. The balance of our household had subtly shifted, like furniture nudged into new alignment. The change was quiet but unmistakable. He never mentioned the past withdrawals again. Neither did I. Words about old missteps often serve only to reopen wounds. I had learned that silence can carry lessons more effectively than lectures. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I found myself reflecting on patience. Not patience as endurance, but as clarity. The restraint I practiced had clarified what mattered, what boundaries could protect, and what dignity must remain intact. I thought about how many times I had given quietly, my time, my energy, my money. None of it had been owed, but the line between generosity and exploitation is thin. Drawing it requires thought, not anger. He asked about repairs to the house during a visit. I described my plans carefully. I did not ask for help, though I would have accepted it if he offered. He did not. That too spoke volumes. I realized then that respect is not about submission. It is about recognition, understanding, and action aligned with awareness. I did not need him to apologize. I needed him to see. We began small rituals again, shared meals, conversations about church, local news, neighbors. Yet I could sense the careful measuring behind each gesture. Familiarity now walked alongside accountability.
I noticed myself smiling more freely too. Not from triumph, not from malice, but from quiet relief. I had set a line and stood firm. That steadiness nurtured something gentle inside me. The following Sunday, I attended services and thought about trust, how fragile it is, how easily it can be bent, quietly, over time, how it is rebuilt, not in haste, but with deliberate care. I reflected on my mother, who had lived alone in her later years. She always said, "Child, respect must be earned, not assumed." I had never fully understood that until now. Marcus called midweek to ask advice about a community event. His tone was careful, considerate. I responded warmly. Guidance offered willingly carries a different weight than guidance demanded. He visited the next day with a small bouquet of flowers from the garden. No words about past actions, just acknowledgement expressed through gesture. That was enough, more than enough. I watched him leave that evening, the door closing softly behind him. The house felt still, settled. I realized the balance had returned, not to how it was, but to something steadier. Alone, I sipped tea and felt a lightness I had not expected. Not relief from the past, but presence in the now, clarity in the quiet. That quiet, I understood, is more sustaining than any transaction.
Months passed without incident, yet I remained quietly vigilant. I checked my statements, not obsessively, but routinely, like a gardener inspecting plants for slow changes. The habit no longer carried fear, only awareness. Experience has a way of teaching caution without bitterness. Marcus settled into a rhythm of small contributions and occasional conversations. There was no grand declaration of restitution, no dramatic confession, just consistency. That consistency felt more like acknowledgement than any apology ever could. I thought often about what trust truly means. Not blind faith, not assumption, not permission given without question. Trust is mutual. It must be honored and recognized continuously, like tending a garden. Neglected, and it wilts quietly, unseen until loss is complete. I remembered my youth when my mother taught me to value independence. She said, "Child, the world may borrow from you, but never forget your worth." I had repeated her lessons to Marcus, hoping he would carry them intact. Sometimes they did, sometimes not. One afternoon, I walked through the neighborhood, observing familiar faces, neighbors whose children had grown like mine. I noticed subtle gestures of respect and care. They were often quiet, almost invisible, yet those small acts held more weight than loud declarations of love. Back home, I reviewed my finances again, noting each deposit Marcus had made. I did not feel anger nor triumph, only clarity. The past had been acknowledged, lessons were in place, and the path forward was steady. I allowed myself to breathe. I thought about silence and how it teaches. It does not punish, it does not humiliate, it simply exists, creating space for understanding to arrive on its own terms. That silence, maintained with discipline, had taught Marcus more than any lecture could. At night, I lit a single lamp in the living room and read quietly. The house was still, the shadows long. I reflected on patience, dignity, and quiet authority. The way a woman holds herself in calm persistence often speaks louder than words ever could. When Marcus called to check in that evening, I smiled as I answered. His voice carried warmth and respect, not entitlement. I spoke with care, offering guidance where it was needed, but allowing him the responsibility to act independently. After the call, I stood by the window and watched the fading light touch the rooftops. Life continued, as it always does. The car was gone, the money had moved, yet something deeper remained intact. My presence, my authority, my clarity, my choice. I realized that recovery, in many ways, is quieter than loss. It grows in small adjustments, careful observation, and deliberate boundaries. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the steady pulse of living on one's own terms. I thought about Marcus's future, the lessons learned, and those yet to come. I hoped he would carry the understanding that respect is never assumed, that love is not permission, and that honesty always matters more than convenience. In the kitchen, I prepared dinner slowly, methodically, savoring each motion. The ordinary work of living had regained its rhythm.
My home felt full, not because of others, but because of the integrity I had reclaimed. I sat afterward with a cup of tea and allowed myself to feel the quiet satisfaction of restoration, not revenge, not resentment, just understanding, and the steady strength that comes from insisting upon respect without shouting. And as I looked out the window, the last light fading, I whispered softly to no one in particular. Quiet carries more truth than words ever could. It lingered there, in the still air, like a promise kept.
The next morning, I rose early and moved through the house with deliberate care. Each step measured, each task purposeful. The quiet of the morning held a weight I welcomed, the kind of silence that allows reflection without urgency, without the need to explain oneself to anyone. I prepared breakfast slowly, humming softly to myself. The ordinary acts, pouring coffee, buttering bread, washing fruit, felt like rituals of self-possession. They reminded me that life continues and that I am present for it on my own terms. Marcus called mid-morning. I did not answer immediately. I let the phone ring, then retrieved it when it suited my pace. That delay, small as it was, shifted the rhythm between us. Courtesy born of boundaries carries its own language. When we spoke, he asked about my week and my plans for the garden. I answered plainly, offering guidance when requested, but holding my ground when he ventured toward assumptions. Conversations now required thought, not assumption, from both of us. I noticed in him a subtle tension, a recalibration of behavior. His ease had been replaced by attentiveness. He spoke more cautiously, measured his words, and paused to consider my response. That attention, rather than obedience, was the gift of learning boundaries. I took a long walk in the afternoon, observing neighbors tending lawns, carrying groceries, greeting one another with quiet familiarity. Life, ordinary and undramatic, contains lessons often overlooked. I carried that knowledge back into my home with gentle pride. Upon returning, I sat by the window with tea in hand. The sunlight fell across the table where Marcus and I had sorted through the financial documents. That table had witnessed a quiet reckoning. Now it reflected continuity rather than fracture. I thought of the years of raising him alone, of teaching him patience, responsibility, and respect. That education had not always been evident, but it existed. Sometimes lessons lie dormant until circumstances call them forth. Later, Marcus arrived with a small gift, a bouquet of flowers from the market. He placed them on the table without fanfare. A gesture, not an apology. I smiled softly, acknowledging the effort without comment. Small recognition can often teach more than speech. We shared a quiet dinner. No mention of money, no discussion of past missteps. Just presence. I allowed the ordinary rhythm of meal and conversation to reassert itself. Trust, I realized, does not return fully, but adapts when boundaries are respected. Afterwards, I washed the dishes and reflected on patience. How it had reshaped our household without confrontation. How it had allowed him to confront his own assumptions without my interference. Quiet can guide without preaching. I noticed a subtle change in my posture as I moved about the kitchen. Upright, steady, deliberate. Body language often communicates more than words ever could. My presence, firm and measured, carried authority that needed no reinforcement. The evening settled into soft shadows. I read a book briefly, but my thoughts returned to lessons learned. Respect is cultivated quietly, boundaries enforced gently, and dignity maintained without spectacle. That understanding anchored me more deeply than anger ever could. I prepared for bed slowly, each movement unhurried. Sleep came easily, untroubled by fear or resentment. The house, the garden, the street outside, all had returned to rhythm. Stability, I recognized, arises from clarity and steadfastness more than control. Before closing my eyes, I whispered again to no one. Some things must be earned, not assumed. And in that quiet, the weight of months lifted slightly, leaving space for reflection, restoration, and calm understanding.
Morning arrived, soft and pale, brushing light across the curtains. I moved through my routine with deliberate steadiness. The kitchen smelled faintly of brewed coffee and baked bread. Ordinary smells anchor memory, reminding me that life continues even after trust has been tested. I glanced at the empty driveway and thought of Marcus. He had come and gone, repaying portions of what was taken, speaking with care,
yet still learning the boundaries I had set. Observation, I realized, is as instructive as instruction. The mail contained bills and letters. I sorted them carefully, noting due dates and payments made. Financial independence is not glamorous. It is measured, deliberate, and consistent. Yet consistency builds quiet strength, the kind that shields against future uncertainty. Marcus called mid-morning, this time without expectation. I answered promptly, greeting him warmly but without urgency. His tone was respectful. He asked how I had slept. I answered honestly. Small inquiries like these now carried weight. They signaled attention rather than entitlement. I reflected on the house itself, each room a repository of years lived, memories layered in furniture, in photographs, in the quiet corners where no one ever visits. That quiet holds authority, even over family who forget its value. Later, I walked outside and tended the garden. I pruned, watered, and removed weeds. Each deliberate motion grounded me. Care for living things mirrors care for oneself. Both require patience, observation, and restraint. Marcus arrived that afternoon, bringing groceries. He placed them on the counter without fuss. I thanked him simply. Small acts of awareness, repeated consistently, rebuild the fragile threads of respect and understanding. During our conversation over tea, he asked about upcoming repairs. I responded with clarity, describing what needed attention and what I would handle myself. Boundaries are most effective when communicated without anger, without demand. I observed him carefully as he listened. His eyes shifted between understanding and hesitation. Learning respect after assumption has been practiced is rarely immediate. It arrives slowly in careful gestures and measured words. After he left, I sat by the window. The light fell across the floor in warm bands. I reflected on patience and the quiet authority it brings. Authority is often misunderstood as control. In truth, it is calm, deliberate presence. I thought of the past months and the gradual reclamation of my autonomy. No dramatic moments had occurred. No shouting, no confrontation. Just the slow, steady recalibration of behavior and expectation. In the kitchen, I prepared dinner, each step deliberate. The aroma of cooking filled the air, a reminder that care given to oneself and to one's surroundings restores both body and mind. Before retiring, I checked the bank account once more. The remaining balance, the small repayments, the clear record, all reflected restored order. Yet it was not money that mattered. It was clarity and the knowledge that boundaries could be honored. I closed the day quietly, feeling the subtle power of self-possession. Marcus was learning, and I was reaffirming myself. Trust, once stretched, can be rebuilt with vigilance and patience. Respect, once assumed, must be reclaimed deliberately. Finally, as night fell, I whispered softly to the empty house. Quiet teaches more than confrontation ever will. The words lingered, weightless but resolute, in the still air.
The following morning, I moved through my home with careful attention, noticing the small details that often go unseen. The kettle whistled gently. The sunlight caught dust motes in a golden glow. Life, even after disruption, resumes its rhythm when we allow ourselves to notice it. Marcus called mid-morning. I let the phone ring for a moment, then answered. His voice was lighter now, less tentative, but still careful. He asked if I needed anything from the store. I told him I was managing, and he accepted that without question. I reflected on the lessons of quiet authority. Discipline without anger carries more weight than a lecture ever could. The house, the garden, the routines, they all reinforce the truth that respect is maintained through consistency, not confrontation. Later, I walked to the corner store for essentials. Neighbors greeted me kindly, offering small smiles and acknowledgement. Life's ordinary interactions reminded me that dignity persists beyond family disputes, anchored in how one carries oneself quietly through the world. At home, I began organizing papers and documents. The act of placing things in order, categorizing, filing, gave me a sense of control over circumstances that had once felt uncertain. Clarity, I realized, begins with deliberate attention to what is tangible. Marcus visited in the afternoon, bringing a small bouquet of fresh flowers. He placed them gently on the table without comment. That gesture, unspoken and modest, spoke volumes about the lessons learned in quiet observation and patient recalibration. We shared a brief conversation over tea. He inquired about my health, the house, the garden. His questions were measured, thoughtful. I responded with honesty, but without over-explaining. Boundaries had become their own form of instruction,
quiet, firm, undeniable. I noticed this subtle shift in his demeanor. His posture was more restrained, his voice steadier, more aware. He was learning the weight of accountability without my needing to demand it. This realization filled me with a quiet satisfaction. The evening descended slowly. I lit a single lamp and began reading, the soft yellow glow illuminating the pages. Reflection came naturally in this light, unhurried and deliberate. I pondered patience, dignity, and the slow reclamation of my autonomy. I thought of the past months and how much had changed without spectacle. No arguments, no shouting, no dramatic ultimatums, just steady observation, careful instruction through presence, and unwavering personal boundaries. Marcus had begun understanding that respect is not granted automatically. It is practiced continuously, acknowledged in small acts, and tested over time. This truth is often slower to take root than anger or disappointment. I prepared dinner slowly, savoring the rhythm of routine. Cooking, cleaning, arranging, these simple acts became acts of reaffirmation, quiet demonstrations of self-respect and personal sovereignty. Afterward, I sat by the window with tea, watching shadows lengthen across the floor. The house felt balanced again. It was not as it had been, nor would it ever return to that state, but a new order had been established. I reflected on trust and autonomy, realizing that boundaries do not distance, they clarify. They allow relationships to exist with honesty rather than assumption. Marcus was learning, and I was reaffirming myself. Before retiring for the night, I whispered softly to the empty house. Patience reshapes what haste breaks. The words hung in the quiet air, a gentle affirmation of lessons lived and understood.
The days follow in gentle predictability. I rose with the sun, prepared breakfast, tended the garden, and kept the house in its quiet order. Each small task reinforced a sense of autonomy, a rhythm uninterrupted by the past disruption. Life, I realized, thrives in constancy more than in spectacle. Marcus visited sporadically, each time bringing small tokens of awareness, sometimes groceries, sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing at all. Each visit reflected his recalibration, the gradual integration of respect and patience he had not fully understood before. I noticed the subtle shifts in our interactions. He listened more carefully, asked fewer assumptive questions, and acknowledged my responses without deflection. Patterns, once subtle, were now more deliberate and consistent, reflecting the lessons silently learned. I reflected on the years of raising him alone. Those early lessons of patience, responsibility, and careful observation had taken root slowly, sometimes hidden under the weight of familiarity. The past months had revealed their true value. One afternoon, I sat by the window, watching neighbors tend their lawns and greet each other. The ordinary cadence of life reminded me that dignity and quiet strength persist beyond family, rooted in consistent, deliberate presence. Marcus mentioned a new community event and asked for my guidance. I offered advice plainly, without embellishment, allowing him to act independently. Guidance, I knew, is most effective when given without overstepping boundaries. The house felt balanced again, not through forced reconciliation, but through steady adherence to principles. My autonomy remained intact, reinforced by the structure I had quietly established. Respect had been regained without confrontation or anger. I reflected on silence and how it had carried instruction more effectively than words ever could. The absence of immediate reaction allowed him to understand consequences and boundaries organically, without resentment or drama. During the evenings, I prepared meals with care, appreciating the tactile rhythm of cooking. Chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and setting the table became acts of self-respect, reminders that ordinary routines carry meaning when performed deliberately. Marcus expressed gratitude occasionally, not out loud but through gestures, placing flowers on the table, handling tasks thoughtfully, speaking with measured attention. Those small acts reinforced the quiet authority I had maintained throughout the months. I recognize that restoration does not always require apology. Sometimes clarity, observation, and patience are sufficient to recalibrate relationships and affirm dignity. The past was acknowledged, the present remained deliberate. The garden flourished under my care, mirroring the household. Growth occurs when tended attentively, without expectation. Boundaries, like plants, need space, consistency, and attention to thrive. I considered the lessons learned through absence and quiet recalibration. Trust, autonomy, respect. These were not returned fully, but were reshaped, stronger for the careful attention and deliberate boundaries maintained over time.
As night fell, I sipped tea by the window, letting the quiet settle around me. The house was calm, the garden serene, and the lessons lived, not merely taught. Strength resided not in loud declarations, but in measured presence. Before sleep, I whispered softly, "Boundaries protect, not punish." And in that quiet affirmation, I felt the steady pulse of regained authority, trust cautiously rebuilt, and dignity reaffirmed.
Morning light filtered softly through the curtains. I moved about the house with deliberate care, tending to dishes, laundry, and small repairs. The rituals of daily life carried weight now, each task reinforcing the quiet authority I had reclaimed. Nothing spectacular, yet everything meaningful. Marcus arrived mid-morning with a package from the store. He placed it on the counter, hesitated briefly, and offered a small nod. That hesitation was telling, a subtle acknowledgement that he understood boundaries and my autonomy were no longer negotiable. I poured coffee and set a plate for him, speaking in measured tones. Conversation remained light but respectful. I did not correct him unnecessarily, nor did I over-explain in the past. He was learning to navigate our interactions without assumption. Later, I sat in the living room, flipping through old photographs. Memories layered themselves across the pages, reminding me of years lived, lessons taught, and resilience earned. The quiet of the house allowed reflection, not regret, to occupy my mind. Marcus asked about the garden, his tone gentle. I explained my plans clearly and calmly. Guidance now carried weight only when solicited, and I observed without directing. That balance, I realized, defined respect more than any argument could. I noticed the small gestures he now offered, holding doors, carrying groceries without comment, speaking thoughtfully rather than assuming. Each act reflected a recalibration shaped by the quiet patience I had maintained over months. Dinner was simple, unhurried. We shared it without discussion of past missteps. The absence of confrontation did not diminish understanding. It allowed presence. Learning through observation and consistent boundaries proved more effective than speech ever could. I reflected on silence and how it had shaped this outcome. Quiet had not been passive. It had guided, taught, and clarified. The lessons he now practiced were rooted in observation, not reprimand. That truth gave me deep satisfaction. Later, I tended the garden, pruning, watering, and planting. The act of care reminded me that patience and deliberate attention nurture both life and relationships. Neglect either, and they falter quietly, unnoticed until damage is done. Marcus stayed briefly after dinner, helping with small tasks. His attentiveness was deliberate now, measured, showing he understood that respect must be practiced, not assumed. The gestures, though small, marked meaningful change. After he left, I reflected on months past. The disappearance of funds, the quiet reckoning, the patient assertion of boundaries. I recognized how much had been reclaimed, my autonomy, dignity, and sense of authority in my own home. I considered how often relationships rely on unspoken understanding. Words can instruct, but presence teaches. Boundaries enforced with calm steadiness carry lessons more durable than those imposed with anger or drama. The evening settled around me. Shadows stretched across the walls as I sipped tea and reflected on clarity and resilience. The house, the garden, the routines, they all reflected the strength gained through deliberate patience. I thought of Marcus's growth, quiet and subtle. He was learning accountability, attention, and respect without coercion. That is often how maturity arrives, slowly through observation and gentle consequence. Before sleep, I whispered softly to myself, true authority comes from presence, not demand. And in that quiet affirmation, I felt restored, vigilant, and at peace with the lessons learned. The morning arrived calm, pale light spilling across the kitchen counter. I moved through my routine deliberately, brewing coffee, arranging breakfast, checking mail. Each ordinary motion carried weight now, affirming the quiet authority I had built and the lessons silently absorbed over months of careful observation. Marcus called mid-morning. I answered after a deliberate pause, my tone steady and calm. He inquired about the week, the garden, the house. I responded plainly, without over-explaining, allowing him the space to engage with responsibility rather than assumption.
I reflected on the months since my savings had quietly disappeared. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting, just patience, observation, and steady enforcement of boundaries. Clarity, I realized, had arrived not through anger, but through deliberate presence and consistent expectation. I spent the afternoon tending the garden, pruning, weeding, and observing the small blooms beginning to appear. Care given to living things mirrors care for oneself, attentive, consistent, deliberate, and reminds one that growth often arrives quietly, unseen until fully evident. Marcus arrived with groceries, placing them on the counter without fanfare. His subtle acknowledgement of boundaries, evident in his measured movements and gentle tone, reflected the lessons he had absorbed over months of patient teaching. We shared a quiet dinner. Conversation remained gentle, respectful, measured. There was no mention of money, no retrospective blame. The absence of drama created space for understanding, for the recognition that trust and respect are earned through consistent practice, not assumption. I reflected on how silence had shaped the outcome. It was not passive, nor was it weakness. Silence had guided, instructed, and clarified. The patient, steady restraint I maintained carried more authority than words ever could, allowing Marcus to learn without coercion. Evening shadows lengthened across the living room as I sipped tea by the window. I thought about the reclamation of autonomy, dignity, and quiet authority. The house felt balanced, not because of confrontation, but because of deliberate adherence to principles and consistency of presence. I considered the lessons Marcus had absorbed. Attention, accountability, respect, and careful observation now informed his actions. He was learning that trust is mutual, autonomy is earned, and boundaries define relationships more enduringly than words alone. Later, I reviewed my finances quietly, noting the small repayments and the clarity restored to my household. Money, I realized, mattered far less than the lessons in respect, boundaries, and self-possession that had been reinforced over months. I prepared for bed with unhurried care, each movement deliberate. The routine reaffirmed my autonomy, grounding me in the quiet power of consistent, patient action. Stability had returned, not imposed by others, but reclaimed through presence and measured vigilance. Before closing my eyes, I whispered softly to the empty house. Respect is learned, not assumed. The words lingered in the quiet, weightless but resolute, marking the culmination of patience, observation, and careful stewardship of self and family. I lay back, feeling the steady pulse of regained autonomy, trust cautiously rebuilt, and dignity firmly reestablished. Silence, patience, and deliberate boundaries had restored what absence had threatened to undo. As sleep approached, I thought of lessons carried forward: quiet strength, deliberate presence, and the unshakable truth that autonomy and respect are never given. They are maintained gently and embodied daily. And finally, in the still night, I whispered to no one in particular. Some truths arrive quietly, and only patience can teach them fully. The weight of months lifted, leaving space for peace, clarity, and the quiet satisfaction of dignity reclaimed.